Going back to the Greeks saw it as a way to expend excess energy. And they did not see any particular, they didn't necessarily think it was bad, but they didn't see anything helpful come out of it. And it really wasn't until centuries later that early educators began recognizing the value of play. And a fellow by the name of Froebel, I think, who was actually the inventor of kindergarten. He was one of the first educators to realize that children needed to actively be involved in play. So a lot of play therapy actually dates back to educators. Probably one of the quintessential issues that we face is this upper and lower brain issue, which has not received a lot of attention until, certainly the last 20 years. And we have, and I will say this the way I was told, we have had a tendency to worship at the throne of the cortex. Education is heavily aimed at the cortex. And in many ways rightfully so, because this is the most adaptable, flexible, fastest learning part of our brain. What we are now learning, well, and let me back up, and a lot of this information that is coming forward is relatively new. When I was in my doctoral training in the late 70s and early 80s, they had just finally begun to arrive at the fact that memory was not located in a single place in the brain. So I mean, we were still relatively early in our science evolution. They were still struggling with the brain structure. They still do. And we didn't really give a lot of weight to the low brain. And what we now realize is that the lower reaches of the brainstem and the diencephalon, which are nonverbal, they're not logical, they don't change quickly, they are associative classical conditioning kind of learners, associative learners. They continue throughout our lives to have massive input into what the cortex does. And one of my favorite quotes is by a lady that I think she's an Israeli neuroscientist, and her name is Shamay Tesuri. And she says, we really have two brains, the upper brain and the lower brain, and they don't communicate together real well. The other quote that I love is that we worship at the throne of the cortex, but that is the part of the brain that often does the bidding of the lower cortex, the lower brain. And so I think we're beginning to understand that we need to understand the entire neural structure of the brain and how all of this happens, because if I am trying to change something that is a low brain, predominantly low brain issue, or the low brain has a major part in it, it may take many, many more rehearsals to learn than it does the cortex. And children who maybe through some untoward event in birth or injury or genetics or whatever may have some of those issues, and we think that because we can tell the child what to do, they will be able to do it. But the neural circuitry may not be quite the same, and it may take a considerable length of time for some children to reroute, to find other areas that will take over for some areas. And I think, again, neuroscience is likely to be very helpful. I have a good friend that is a neuropsychologist in California. His name's Paul Levy. and Paul does lots and lots of school consultations. And he said, when I began, I would go to the IEP meeting and everybody would say what they thought, and they would ask me last. He said, they no longer do that. They ask me to explain what's happening with the brain first, because they've come to realize that everything they do is going to change based on what I tell them about the brain. And he says, when we do that, when we take those issues into account, we can be much more efficient and much more successful in helping design something that the child is more likely going to be able to do successfully.